This is Nick from Nick's Listening Space, and today we're going to talk about the Aiyima D07. So at first glance, the D07 looks just like another budget DAC with kind of all the full features that you would expect, in a budget DAC. I think that for around $100, this might be a really great option if you're somebody looking to try out the AKM DAC chip flavor. But I do think that after living with this guy for a couple of weeks, when it came time to making this review, I realized that my review of this guy wasn't just another budget DAC. Instead, I think that this is going to be a review about two very different ways of listening to music. So for the past couple of weeks, I've been comparing the D07 against my reference DAC, the Topping D50 III. And of course, I've been pairing that with multiple, other pieces of gear and speakers. Now, I don't want to spend 20 minutes talking about measurements or specifications. I want to answer kind of one simple question. What kind of listening experience does the D07 create? So let's find out. So when it comes to build quality, the D07 is exactly what I've come to expect from Aiyima. I think that what we get here in terms of build quality is excellent at this price point because we are getting a fully aluminum chassis and it feels very solid. The machining is nice and clean. I think nothing on this device feels sort of cheap. The front panel on this guy is pretty simple. We get a volume knob that also is going to double as an input selector. Plus, we get a switch on the front that controls two independent RCA outputs. And something important to note here is that you can send a signal out to both RCA outputs at the same time. Now, this could be genuinely useful depending on your use case, or maybe you have a different kind of setup, or maybe you want to send something to a different room. Those are kind of all great features. Now, this guy also has a DAC bypass mode, which essentially allows you to run a full signal out to a preamplifier and then onto a power amp. Now, one thing I want to mention here in regards to the power delivery of this guy is that the D07 does not have a dedicated DC input. So the USB that you get on the back of this guy is doing double duty and being used for both data as well as power. Now, for this review, what I did was I used my Topping P50 linear power supply to power it, and then what I did is I send the audio signal via coax from my Bluesound Node. So to my ears, this sounded consistently better than having everything fed over USB. And I can't exactly say why that is, but this is just really what I heard when listening to it. Now, something important to note here is that when it comes to the Topping P50 linear power supply, it is spec'd at sort of 5 volts, 1 amp. Now the D07, at least on the back of it, it says that it requires a 5 volt, 2 amp circuit to power it. But for whatever reason, my Topping linear power supply is powering it just fine. So my recommendation here is not necessarily to go use exactly what I've done here. I do think you should go out and find a better power supply. But your other options out there on the market could just be, a better wall wart or a better brick that you get with your phone. You could also look at, Duke Audio has a linear power supply. I know a couple other people out there have them as well. So in my experience, I think this is how you should power this guy. Now, my first impression of the D07 was honestly a little disappointing. Now, when we directly compare it to the Topping D50 III, the D07 sounded softer, okay? There wasn't as much sparkle up top as what we would get or what I would expect with my Topping D50. I think the instrument edges also are not drawn with the same level of precision. When it comes to the background of this guy, it's not quite as dark. When I play this, at least initially in my setup, I played it through my Schiit Asgard 3 with my Schiit Buff, as well as my Fozzy Audio ZA3 power amp. And the differences here were pretty obvious when I would switch back and forth. At least for the first couple hours of testing this guy out, I really was wondering if the D07 was kind of slightly veiled. Now, instead of rushing to a conclusion, I kind of moved this then into my reference system and kept listening. Now, after, several days, I think my perspective of the DO7 changed quite a bit because I really stopped focusing on what I thought that I was losing with the DO7 and really just started appreciating what the DO7 does differently. So for the rest of this review, the DO7 remained in kind of DAC bypass mode, powered by my Topping P50, fed by a coax signal from my Bluesound Node, then fed into my Freya Plus, then into my line magnetic, powering, my ELAC debut speakers. So I want to kind of talk about a couple of themes here to discuss sound quality. And those themes are kind of things like air and atmosphere, the human voice, this idea of controlled chaos. And then finally, I want to talk about wood, steel, and strings. And essentially, I want to talk about how does acoustic sound on this guy, or acoustical instruments. So I think one of the first themes here that kept reappearing in my notes was this idea of atmosphere. So certain artists like Beach House, Chromatics, Still Corners, Always build music around this idea of space rather than just pure impact. These songs or these artists use these things like long decays or this idea of layering reverb, lots of shimmering guitars, distant vocals. These are artists that I think create this sense of etherealness, or they have this ethereal kind of quality to them. And essentially, I don't think that these are recordings that necessarily are asking you to focus on any one individual particular detail. Rather, I think that these are the kinds of recordings that really have you sink into an atmosphere or a kind of mood. Now, one track that I kept coming back to is this track called The Hours by Beach House. When we play that track through my D50, the presentation felt more sculpted. Synthesizers have sharper edges. Individual echoes that are recurring in this song are much easier to follow. Victoria Legrand's voice floats in this darker background that's more open. The DO7 approaches this same recording differently because now we get a little bit softer edges. The vocals here gain more body. Instead of separating kind of every layer, we're getting something that feels more cohesive. It sounds more cohesive. The D50, I think, is giving me a clearer window into kind of the production of the song, whereas the DO7 kind of makes it easier to just disappear into the music. I think that really, for me, kind of becomes the defining theme of this review. If there's kind of one theme or category that I want to talk about here, it is this idea of vocals. So on a recording like Stay Safe by Rye, this is a very beautifully restrained performance where kind of every instrument on this track kind of exists to support the vocals. Now, when I play this track through the Topping D50, Rye's voice kind of floats effortlessly within this soundstage. Right? There's more separation happening, but there's also more breath and essentially this trailing reverberation that happens with her voice stands out with greater clarity. But when we play it on the DO7, there is this kind of shift in the balance or the frequency range here. Not necessarily by bringing vocals closer, but by giving them more weight. So there is more of a chesty resonance happening here on the DO7 than there is on the D50. I might describe this as having more body. Vocals, instead of floating above the music, the singer just feels more rooted within the background. So, and I think that pattern kind of carries throughout many vocal recordings that I listen to on this device, whether it's artists like Joy Oladukin or artists like Manchester Orchestra. The D50, for me, just consistently drew my attention toward this recording. And the DO7 really drew my attention toward the performance. In some sense, the DO7 sounds more natural to me. Up to this point, we've been listening to beautifully recorded music, but now I want to do the opposite. Now, some of my favorite recordings are recordings that intentionally live on this kind of edge of chaos. They're recordings that have a lot of dense vocals or layered guitars. They're recordings that have these walls of reverb. They can be very emotionally or sometimes overwhelming, essentially. But that's why I think that these kinds of recordings are really great to test out, because they really show us how something can make something sound a little bit better, or maybe make a less than great recording sound better. So one perfect song that I can think of is a song called Capital Karma by Manchester Orchestra. The recording slowly buries itself in these layers of reverberation. There are these echoes in the vocals that sort of stack and build up on top of one another. And you can hear the room become overwhelmed with that. Now, when we play that same song through my Topping D50 V3, every reflection is very illuminated or shown. Essentially, every vocal artifact is revealed. Every layer of every reverb happening there in that track is shown, okay? It's just a revealing recording when we play it through the topping. But I think that as those reflections build up, the presentation becomes much more demanding. We need better gear to really keep up with it. So when we play that same track on the D07, it just takes a different approach. Instead of sharpening all of the transients, it kind of just allows all of those reflections in the room to kind of merge into like one larger kind of acoustic sound. Rather, nothing really disappears here. It just simply feels more cohesive. And I think that becomes one of the biggest surprises of this review, is that, essentially the D07, it's not necessarily hiding information, but I do think it has a bit of a collapsed soundstage. Another way that you could maybe describe it is having a more mid-range kind of centric sound. Now, the final theme that I want to discuss here in regards to the sound quality of the D07 is probably one of my favorite aspects about this guy, and it's really the way that acoustic instruments sound, in particular things like guitars or even pianos. There is a song called Kali Strings by this band called Manchester Orchestra, and it's on this album called Union Chapel Live. And on that particular song, what we're getting is essentially just a voice and a guitar and a real room. And when we play that song through my, topping DAC, what we're getting is a sound that is more about kind of the guitar strings. Essentially, there's more of an attack, or the attack of the guitar itself has a sharper sound to it. There's more of a metallic kind of sheen to the strings themselves. And when we shift back to the D07, my attention is drawn kind of away from the strings and more towards the instrument itself. Essentially, what we get now is more of the sound of the body, or the body of the guitar, and it's less about that initial attack of the strings. And there's more of a resonance here. And I think that, after, reviewing this and going through my notes, essentially, I came to the same conclusion. To me, that is that the D50 draws my attention more towards the recording by revealing more nuance. And the D07 really draws my attention more towards the performance. Sometimes I think that that is kind of the more important distinction when we want to listen to music. I think if your priority is to have absolute precision and edge definition and kind of that holographic imaging, then I think the Topping D50 III remains kind of my reference system. But the D07, never really tried to be that DAC. I think instead the D07 kind of keeps my attention away from the equipment. and really back toward this idea of the music. More than anything, guys, this review really reminds me of something that I recently learned while working in high-end audio. And, the systems I remember the most weren't the ones with the biggest soundstage or even the most detail. Rather, the things that are remembered are the systems that sound the most effortless. They don't draw attention to themselves. The equipment just disappears. And I think all that remained was the performance of the musicians. And I'm not saying that the D07 sounds like those systems. I don't think it does. But every once in a while, it gives me that feeling of naturalness. There's just something very natural about the way that it sounds. And I think that's why this is such an interesting DAC at this price point. And not because it helps you hear more into the recording. I still think the D50 is better for that. But I think that it does perhaps help you forget about the equipment a little bit less. So if you guys like this review, please hit that like button down below. Tell me what you guys think. Have you heard this DAC? What's your favorite DAC chip? Do you guys prefer an ESS DAC chip? Do you prefer AKM? I mean, I don't have a lot of experience with AKM DAC chips, and so this is really kind of my first foray, and it's been a real fun one, I think. And I've been pretty impressed for about $99. I think one caveat here is that you can definitely improve the power delivery of this DAC, which I think you could do for another $80, give or take. It's questionable whether or not it's worth it then at that price point, but I think that's sort of up to you guys. So yeah. Anyways, if you guys want to see more reviews, please subscribe to my channel. And thanks for watching, guys. All right, bye-bye.